My name is Salith Oren, and I have been lying to my people for 11 years. Not in ways they'd recognize, not in ways that left marks or evidence. I lied with inflection, with pauses in the right places, with the careful widening of my crest when I described the burning ones descending from the black sky in chariots of light, their bodies wreathed in flame that did not consume them. That detail, the fire that did not consume, I added that myself. It wasn't in the original texts. The original text said the burning ones came in gray ships and smelled like mineral oil. Mineral oil doesn't fill a plaza. Mineral oil doesn't make children grip their parents' arms and lean forward, pupils wide, wanting more. So I gave them fire instead, and they loved me for it, and I told myself it didn't matter, because the burning ones were gone. Dead or transcended or mythologized into harmlessness across the 32 centuries since the last sighting. What damage could a little fire do to a story about ghosts? I was the 12th Keeper of the long telling, the only oral historian on Vaelothi Prime authorized to recite the complete cycle, all 914 stanzas of the Burning One's mythos, from first ascent to final silence. I'd memorized every line by the age of 14. I'd started embellishing by 16. The embellishments were small at first, a more dramatic verb, a sharper image, the kind of adjustments any storyteller makes when they feel an audience dimming. But over the years, they accumulated. The gray ships became silver, then white, then luminous. The burning ones themselves grew taller, their voices deeper, their technology more impossibly advanced. In my version, they could crack moons with a thought. In the original texts, they used chemical propellant rockets and couldn't even fold space. I told myself the spirit of the story was true, even if the details weren't. The burning ones had come. They had done extraordinary things. They had vanished. The specifics were academic. Then the sky went dark, and the specifics became the only thing that mattered. It was the 43rd day of the harvest alignment, which meant half the population of Velothi Prime was outdoors. The alignment only happens every 8 years. Both suns visible simultaneously from the northern hemisphere. The fields golden with ripe thiel grain. The air warm enough that even the deep valley clans come up to the surface for the communal reaping. It's the closest thing we have to a planetary holiday. I was on the recitation stage in Veladaan, the capital, performing the 7th stanza, the one about the burning ones teaching the first Vaelothi how to purify water, to an audience of roughly 11,000. I remember the exact passage I was on, because I never finished it. And the tallest among them knelt beside the poisoned river and placed a device no larger than a closed fist into the shadow hit first. Not a cloud shadow. Not an eclipse. We'd had no eclipse predicted for another 4 years. This was a shadow that moved wrong. It crossed the plaza from east to west in about 3 seconds, like something enormous had passed between us and the suns, and then it was gone, and the light returned. 11,000 people looked up. I looked up. The sky was empty. Then it happened again. Faster. West to east this time. A darkness so total that for a half second, the stars came out in the middle of the afternoon. I saw them. Pinpricks of light in a sky that should have been gold. Then the suns returned, and the stars vanished, and the shadow was gone. The crowd noise shifted. Not panic yet. Confusion. Murmuring. Crests flattening in that instinctive way that means I don't understand what I just perceived, and I need someone to tell me I'm safe. I stood on the stage with the amplification rod still warm in my hand, and said nothing, because I was staring at the patch of sky where the shadow had been, and I was doing arithmetic I didn't want to finish. Both suns were at peak luminosity, The shadow had been total. Not partial. Not filtered. Total. Whatever cast, it had been large enough and close enough to block all light from 2 stars, simultaneously across an area of at least several city blocks. Nothing in our system was that large. Nothing in our fleet. Nothing in the Concorde's registry. The third shadow lasted 9 seconds. Long enough for the temperature to drop. Long enough for the thiel fields on the eastern plateau to trigger their cold response curl, the stalks folding inward like fists closing. Long enough for every child in the plaza to start crying at once. When the light came back, the public address system activated the emergency tone. 3 rising notes that most people had only heard in drills. The harmonist's voice, calm in the way that means terrified, saying that all citizens should proceed to covered structures and await further information. I didn't go to a covered structure. I went to the Athendral. The Athendral is the oldest building in Veladaan. Stone walls 3 meters thick, deep underground, temperature stable, acoustically perfect. It's where the long-telling texts are stored, the originals, on cured thale leaf parchment, sealed in nitrogen cases. My predecessor's predecessor had insisted on physical redundancy even after everything was digitized, and I'd always thought that was sentimental, an old keeper's attachment to old things. I went to the vault room, and I opened the nitrogen cases and I started reading, not reciting, reading. Word by word, with my embellishments stripped away, looking for the thing I was suddenly afraid I'd buried under 11 years of better storytelling. The original 7th stanza didn't say the burning ones could crack moons. It said they arrived in a ship that blocked the river's reflection of the sky, a ship large enough to cast a shadow on water. The original 3rd stanza didn't say they came in chariots of light. It said they came slowly, and the dark they brought was patient, and the dark was shaped like mercy, because it shielded us from the dying sun's last burning. I read that line 3 times. The dark was shaped like mercy. In my version, the burning ones arrived in blazing glory. In the original, they arrived as a shadow. They came between a dying sun and a world being cooked alive, and they used their ship, their gray, mineral oil-smelling ship, as a sunshade. I sat on the stone floor and pressed my crest against the cold wall and understood, with a clarity that felt like a hand around my throat, that I'd been telling the story not just wrong, but backwards. The burning ones didn't burn. They blocked the burn, and something was blocking our suns right now. The civic resonance chamber, our parliament, more or less convened within 2 hours. I was not invited. Oral historians have no political standing. We are cultural functionaries, one step above festival decorators in the governmental hierarchy. I found this out when I approached the chamber entrance, and a security officer I'd known for 6 years put her hand on my chest and said, "Keeper Oren, this session is restricted to operational authorities." There are references in the long telling that directly describe, I'm sure there are. You can submit a cultural advisory through the Heritage Bureau. The Heritage Bureau was closed. It was a harvest holiday. I walked to the bureau office and found it locked, and came back to the chamber entrance and stood there, because I didn't know where else to go that mattered. Inside, I learned later, the session was chaos. Veladaan's orbital monitoring network had detected the object within minutes of the first shadow. It was in a high orbit roughly 400,000 kilometers out, and it was massive. The preliminary estimate was 11 kilometers along its longest axis. Later scans revised this upward, then upward again. 19 kilometers. Our largest military vessel was 800 meters. The monitoring network classified it as an asteroid on an unusual trajectory, then reclassified it as artificial when the spectrographic returns showed metallic composites that don't occur naturally, then flagged it as unknown origin. Then, when the object adjusted its own orbit by 6 degrees, without any visible thrust, upgraded the alert to existential. The Concord was notified. The Concord is the interstellar governance body 12 species, 31 systems, a mutual defense pact that has never been tested, because nobody has ever attacked any of us with anything larger than a trade dispute. The Concord's military assessment office responded within 90 minutes with a message I would later see transcribed. Object does not match any registered vessel, station, or construct in the Concord database. No territorial claim to the Vaelothi system by any non-signatory species. Recommend local containment and observation. Concord Rapid Response Fleet can be mobilized within 60 standard days. 60 days. The thing was already here. There was a second message, appended by an analyst whose name was redacted. Structural profile bears superficial resemblance to pre-Concord Deep Archive entries. Recommend cross-referencing with mythological and cultural databases. Low confidence match to Burning One's descriptors in Vaelothi oral tradition. That message reached the civic resonance chamber at the same time I was standing outside it, being told my expertise was not operationally relevant. Counselor Thenis Rav, a career infrastructure administrator who had never, to my knowledge, read a single stanza of the long telling, was the one who finally opened the door and pulled me inside. She didn't look happy about it. Keeper Oren, it seems your bedtime stories just became classified intelligence. Sit down and tell us everything you know about these burning ones. She said burning ones, the way you'd say imaginary friends. I sat down. I looked at the faces around the table, 22 counselors, the military liaison, the orbital monitoring chief, 2 Concord communication officers who had been on planet for the holiday and were now pale with the sudden weight of relevance. They were all waiting for me. And I had to decide, right there, with the shadows still passing over the city outside, and the object sitting in our sky like a held breath, whether to tell them the version of the story I'd been telling for 11 years, or the version that was actually true. I told them the true version. Mostly. I started with the historical framework, the long tellings age, its chain of oral transmission, the 13 keepers before me, the 4 textual sources that survived the Vashan fire. I established its provenance the way an archivist would, not a performer. I could feel myself flattening, draining the color out, stripping the fire from the burning ones, and leaving them gray and chemical-smelling and small. The original texts describe a species called the human in phonetic Vaelothi, I said. Not tall, not luminous, not wreathed in fire. The texts describe them as roughly our height, bipedal, soft-skinned, with no natural armor, no crest display, no bioluminescence. They arrived in a single ship of significant but not extraordinary size. You described them as sunbreakers at last year's alignment recitation, said Counselor Neth, who had been in that audience. You said they carried weapons that could unmake worlds. I felt my crest go flat. I embellished that. Silence. The original texts say they carried tools, not weapons. The ship was gray. The technology was functional, not transcendent. The most extraordinary thing the texts describe is that they stayed for 4 generations and helped us rebuild after the solar flare crisis, and then they left. And the part about cracking moons? I added that. More silence, the kind that has texture. I could feel 24 people recalculating me from cultural treasure to liability. What else did you add? I told them. All of it. Every embellishment, every inflation, every detail I'd sharpened or replaced or invented because it made the story land harder. The luminous ships, the godlike technology, the booming voices, the fire that didn't consume. I laid it all out and watched my own mythology collapse on the table between us, like a building losing its supports, floor by floor. When I finished, Counselor Rav said, "So the version of this species that the entire Vaelothi population believes the version children are raised on, the version that shapes our understanding of what might be up there right now, is substantially a fiction you personally authored. The core events are, is it a fiction, Keeper? The specific capabilities I attributed to them are not supported by the source texts. No." Rav leaned back. "Then we have 19 kilometers of something in our sky, and our only cultural reference for it is a story you've been improving for a decade." I had no response to that because she was exactly right. Military liaison Deshar took over. He was practical in a way I found simultaneously reassuring and humiliating. He didn't care about the mythology. He cared about what the original texts could tell us about the object's possible capabilities, intentions, and communication protocols. I went through the relevant stanzas. The original said the human communicated verbally and through crude visual displays. They ate food similar to ours. They breathed a similar atmosphere. They had arrived from a direction the ancient Vaelothi associated with a specific star cluster, which modern astronomy identified as a region approximately 42 light-years away. "Did they indicate they'd return?" Deshar asked. "The 9th stanza, the final silence, says they told the 14th Council they were leaving to help others, and that they would—" I paused, pulling the exact phrasing from memory. The real phrasing. "Keep the path warm between our hearths." Meaning? It's ambiguous. It could mean they intended to maintain contact. It could be a farewell courtesy. The 7th Keeper interpreted it as a promise of return. The 9th Keeper thought it was a euphemism for goodbye. What do you think? Nobody had ever asked me that. Not in an operational context. Not as though my answer might guide a decision that mattered. "I think they meant it literally," I said. "I think they kept a navigational route active. I think warm is a propulsion or navigation term that our ancestors translated as best they could." Deshar looked at the orbital monitoring chief. "If the object came from that star cluster, what's our estimated transit time at known propulsion limits?" The chief ran the calculation. "For any species in the Concord, at maximum theoretical drive output, roughly 600 years. "And the Burning One's mythology dates to?" I answered. 3,200 years ago. But the original texts describe their propulsion as slow. Chemical. The transit time at their described technological level would be— I didn't want to finish the sentence. Would be what, Keeper? Centuries. Many centuries. They were not a fast-moving civilization. They were a patient one. That night, the object in our sky did something new. It moved between us and both suns, simultaneously not passing through, but positioning itself, holding, and the shadow fell over the northern hemisphere and stayed. Not darkness. Not the total blackout of the initial passes. A partial shade, precisely calibrated. The temperature in the shadow zone dropped by 4 degrees over 2 hours. The agricultural monitoring stations reported that the Thael fields had stopped their cold curl. The shade was deep enough to cool, but not deep enough to trigger hibernation responses. Someone on the monitoring team, a junior analyst named Korath, who would later become more important than any of us expected, ran a comparison against historical climate records from 32 centuries ago. The solar flare crisis that the long-telling described, the event the Burning Ones had arrived during, had elevated surface temperatures by roughly 15 degrees and was cooking the early Vaelothi in their own atmosphere. The shade from the object dropped our current temperature by 4 degrees. 4 degrees was the exact differential between our current average and the temperature optimum for Thail grain pollination. It wasn't blocking our suns to threaten us. It was adjusting our sunlight like someone tuning an instrument. By the third day, I had become the most important person on Vaelothi Prime, and I had never been less qualified for anything in my life. The Civic Resonance Chamber established an advisory position, mythological liaison, a title that didn't exist before, and that I suspect was named by someone who resented having to create it. My job was to cross-reference every action the object took against the Longtelling's original texts and provide real-time cultural analysis. Real-time cultural analysis of a 3,000-year-old oral poem, while something the size of a city rearranged our sunlight. The problem was not the object. The object was, so far, doing nothing aggressive. The shade was benign, possibly beneficial. It had made no attempt to communicate. It had responded to none of our signals. It simply sat in our sky and filtered our light with a precision that made our best engineers go quiet in a way I recognized, because it was the same way audiences go quiet when a story hits them somewhere they weren't braced. The problem was my people. By the third day, the population had split into factions, and every one of them was arguing about my story. Not the real texts, my version. The embellished version. The one with fire and moon cracking and godlike power. The Reverent faction mostly rural, mostly traditional, mostly the communities where the long-telling was still a living spiritual practice believed the Burning Ones had returned as promised. They held vigils in the Thail fields under the shade, singing the hymn of first ascent, which I should note I had also substantially rewritten 9 years ago to improve the melodic structure. They were worshipping a song I'd edited for aesthetic reasons. The defensive faction, urban, secular, politically aligned with the military infrastructure lobby, believed the object was a weapon platform, positioning for attack. They cited the Longtelling's descriptions of the Burning One's terrible power as evidence. My descriptions. My embellished, inflated, fabricated descriptions of capabilities that the original texts never attributed to these beings. The rationalist faction rejected the Longtelling entirely and demanded the Concord intervention fleet be accelerated. They pointed out correctly that basing planetary defense strategy on a 3,000-year-old myth interpreted by a storyteller who had admitted to fabrication was insane. They were all right. They were all using my words against reality, for reality, and around reality, and the words were wrong, and I couldn't fix them because you can't unspeak a story. You can retract it. You can correct it. You can stand on a stage and say I lied about the fire. But the image is already in their minds. The fire is already burning in their memory, and it will keep burning long after the retraction fades, because stories are stickier than corrections. Every storyteller knows this. It's why we have power. It's why we're dangerous. On the 5th day, the factions became political parties. On the 7th day, they became movements. On the 9th day, a reverent march to the civic chamber clashed with a defensive counter-protest, and 14 people were hospitalized. Counselor Rav summoned me to her office. Your story is tearing this planet apart, Keeper. It's not my... I stopped. It was my story. That was exactly the problem. What do you need me to do? I need you to go on the planetary broadcast and tell the truth. I did tell the truth. I told the chamber. You told 24 people. There are 9 billion who still believe the version you spent a decade perfecting. I need you to stand in front of all of them and say you made it up. I understood what she was asking. I also understood what it would cost. Not to me, my reputation was already shredded within the chamber. But the long-telling wasn't just my story. It was the central narrative of Vaelothi civilization, the foundational myth, the story we told ourselves about where we came from and what we were worth, that once, in our darkest moment, someone had crossed the void to help us, that we mattered enough to be found. If I went on the broadcast and said the Burning Ones were not gods, not sunbreakers, not luminous beings of transcendent power, if I said they were short, soft-skinned, slow, and ordinary, I wouldn't just be correcting a story. I would be dismantling the emotional architecture of my entire culture in the middle of a crisis. If I do this, I said, the Reverent faction collapses. They're the only group that isn't afraid right now. They're keeping 900 million people calm because they believe help has arrived. If I take that away, and the defensive faction is arming because of the same story. They're requisitioning mining charges and trying to retrofit cargo ships with weapons because they believe your moon-cracking sunbreakers are positioning to destroy us. Your myth is simultaneously sedating half the planet and radicalizing the other half, and both reactions are based on your fiction. She was right again. She was annoyingly, consistently right. I'll do the broadcast, I said. Tomorrow morning, prime alignment, full planetary carry. I went home that night and sat in my recitation room, the small stone chamber where I practiced, where every stanza lived in the echo of the walls, and I tried to write what I would say. I wrote 9 drafts, threw them all away. The problem wasn't finding the words. The problem was that truth, unadorned, sounds thin. It sounds like less. And when people are afraid, less is not what they need to hear. I stood in front of the broadcast array at dawn. The shade was still overhead. The object hadn't moved in 4 days, holding its position with an accuracy that our engineers said required constant micro-adjustments they couldn't detect. It was maintaining our optimal temperature to within a fraction of a degree. Whoever built that ship was paying attention to us at a level of detail that was either deeply caring or deeply clinical, and I couldn't tell which. 9 billion people. Every screen, every audio relay, every public address node on the planet. I had never spoken to more than 20,000 at once. My hands were steady, which surprised me. My crest was high, which surprised me more. Something in me had decided to be calm and hadn't consulted the rest of me first. My name is Salith Oren, I said. I am the 12th Keeper of the Long Telling, and I need to tell you something about the story you know. I paused. In performance, you pause for effect. This wasn't for effect. I genuinely didn't know if I could say what came next. The Burning Ones, the beings I've described to you at every alignment, every festival, every recitation for 11 years, are real. The core of the long telling is verified history. Approximately 3,200 years ago, a species from a distant star system came to Vaelothi during our worst crisis and helped us survive. They stayed for generations. They taught us water purification, agricultural rotation, basic metallurgy. Then they left. This is true. I took a breath. What is not true is the way I told it. I could feel 9 billion people listening, not hearing listening. There's a difference. Hearing is passive. Listening is an act of trust. They were trusting me with their attention, and I was about to repay that trust by burning down the house I'd built in it. The Burning Ones did not burn. They did not carry weapons that could unmake worlds. They did not crack moons. They were not tall or luminous or wreathed in sacred fire. The original texts, the actual texts, written by the people who met them, describe them as approximately our height. Soft-skinned, no armor, no natural weapons. They arrived in a gray ship that smelled like mineral oil. They used chemical rockets. They could not fold space. They were, by every physical measure the texts provide, unremarkable. I heard my own voice in the relay echo, bouncing off buildings, coming back to me a half-second delayed. It sounded smaller than I wanted it to. I changed the story because I thought it needed to be bigger. I gave them fire because fire is dramatic. I gave them moon-breaking power because power fills a plaza. I made them gods because gods make a better tale than engineers, and I was vain enough to think the story was mine to improve. Silence. Not the kind I was used to. Not the reverent hush of an audience waiting for the next line. This was the silence of people reclassifying the person speaking to them. The object in our sky may be related to the beings in the long telling. It may not. But if it is, if these are the same species, returning after 32 centuries, then you need to understand what the actual texts say about them, not what I made up. I pulled the relevant passage from memory, the real one, unembellished, in the original archaic Vaelothi that I'd been trained to preserve and had instead overwritten with my own preferences. They were small, and they were soft, and they broke easily. They did not fly as the river birds fly, but slowly, in shells of metal that groaned. And when they came between us and the dying sun, it was not with glory, but with weight. They bore the heat on their hull as a laborer bears stone, and the hull bent, and they stayed. I let the words sit. They sounded nothing like my version. They were plain. They were clumsy. They had the graceless specificity of someone describing exactly what they saw without any instinct to make it beautiful. They were more powerful than anything I had ever written. The burning ones did not save us because they were powerful. The original texts are clear on this. They saved us because they chose to use what they had, which was not much, and they did not leave when it cost them. Their hull bent. They stayed. I lowered the amplification rod. I don't know what's in our sky. I don't know if it's them. But I owe you the real story, because the real story might be the only thing that helps us understand what's happening. And the real story is not about gods. It's about people who crossed a void they could barely survive because they heard someone was in trouble. I stepped off the stage. It went worse than I expected, and better than I deserved. The Reverent faction didn't collapse. It fractured. About a third accepted the correction and reoriented their faith around the original texts, the small, slow, bending-hulled beings who bore weight rather than wielding power. They called themselves the faithful readers and started distributing the unembellished stanzas within hours. Another third rejected my retraction entirely, insisting the embellishments were divinely inspired and the original texts were the corrupted version. They called themselves the true flame, and they stopped listening to me permanently. The final third simply went quiet, which frightened me more than either of the other reactions. The defensive faction's response was faster and worse. If the burning ones were not gods, if they were small, soft, slow, and technologically limited, then the object in the sky was even more terrifying, because it exceeded everything even my inflated mythology had described. A species that couldn't crack moons 32 centuries ago now had a ship 19 kilometers long that could fine-tune stellar radiation in real time. The defensive faction's argument shifted from, they're powerful and dangerous, to they've had 3,000 years to advance, and we have no model for what they've become. I couldn't argue with this, because it was true. On the 12th day, the object transmitted, not to us. That was the disorienting part. The transmission was aimed outward, away from Vaelothi, toward deep space, in a direction our communication arrays couldn't track without reorienting. The monitoring team detected it as a burst of structured electromagnetic radiation lasting 42 seconds, dense with information, using encoding patterns that matched nothing in the Concord's communication standards. It was talking to someone else. The defensive faction took this as confirmation of a coordinated invasion. The Reverent factions, both of them, took it as a summons for more angels. The rationalists demanded the Concord be informed immediately, which it was. And the Concord's response was a second message, shorter and more alarming than the first. Concord intelligence has identified the transmission target region as an uncharted stellar nursery containing no known civilizations. Revised assessment. The Vaelothi object may be a forward element of a previously unknown interstellar polity operating outside conquered space. Rapid response timeline unchanged, 60 standard days. 48 days remaining. Something in our sky was calling for friends, and our only cavalry was 2 months away. That night, military liaison Deschar came to the Athendral. He was not there for the texts. He was there for me. Keeper Oren, we're going to attempt direct contact with the object. Laser pulse communication, mathematical sequences, standard first contact protocol. Has the Concord authorized? The Concord is 60 days away. We're authorizing ourselves. He sat down across from me. In the vault light, he looked older than I'd realized, tired in the way that comes from making decisions faster than you can assess them. I want you on the communication team. I'm a storyteller. You're the only person on this planet who has spent more than a decade studying this species. I don't care if half of what you know is made up. The other half might be the difference between a greeting and a provocation. The communication attempt launched on day 14. We used the orbital relay station, the largest transmitter on the planet, normally reserved for Concord diplomatic traffic. The first contact team was 12 people, 4 communication engineers, 3 xenolinguists, 2 military officers, the monitoring chief, Korath the junior analyst, and me. Korath had become indispensable without anyone noticing. While the politicians debated and the factions clashed, she had been quietly building a behavioral model of the object based solely on its movements. She'd tracked every positional adjustment, every shadow variation, every thermal shift, and mapped them against our agricultural cycles, our weather patterns, and our population distribution. It's not just shading us, she told the team, pulling up her analysis. It's shading us differently in different regions. The agricultural zones get deeper shade. The urban zones get less. It's modulating by use type. How would it know our land use types? One of the xenolinguists asked. It's been watching for at least 18 days, assuming it was observing before it let us see it. That's enough time to map agricultural activity from thermal signatures. Or, I said, and everyone looked at me, it already had maps. Silence. 3,000 years ago, the humans spent 4 generations here. If they kept records, even basic ones, a returning vessel might have ancestral survey data. 32-century-old agricultural maps wouldn't match current. The Thale fields have been in the same valleys for 6,000 years. The soil chemistry dictates it. A 3,000-year-old map of our farmland would be about 80% accurate. Korath checked her data. Her crest went rigid. The shading pattern matches the River Valley Agricultural Network almost perfectly. The regions that don't match are the ones that have shifted in the last millennia. It was using old maps. It had come here with old maps, and it was using them to help. And where the maps were wrong, it was correcting in real time. The laser pulse went out at midday. A standard mathematical sequence primes, then geometric progressions, then a simple query format that Concord had developed for first contact situations. We sent it and waited. The response came in 11 minutes. Not in mathematics, not in any coded format. In audio, transmitted on a frequency our standard receivers could process. at a volume calibrated to be clearly audible without distortion. A voice, speaking Vaelothi, archaic Vaelothi, the dialect of the Long-Telling's original texts, a version of our language that hadn't been spoken conversationally in 2,000 years. Pronunciation slightly wrong, vowels flattened in places, the consonant clusters handled as though the speaker's mouth wasn't quite shaped for them, but intelligible. Completely intelligible. Friend Vaeloth, long between. We kept the path warm. We hear you are well. May we come closer? 12 people sat in the relay station and nobody breathed. Korath recovered first. They learned our language 32 centuries ago, and they've been maintaining it? Or they have records, the lead xenolinguist said. Audio recordings from the original contact. They could have been studying them the whole time. For 3,200 years. They kept a navigational path active for 3,200 years. Why not a language file? I was crying. I don't think anyone noticed because they were all focused on the transmission equipment, but I should be honest about it. I was crying. Not from relief, not from fear, from recognition. We kept the path warm. It was the same phrase, the original 9th stanza, the final silence. They said they would keep the path warm between our hearths, and here it was the same words, returned across 3 millennia, pronounced imperfectly by a mouth that wasn't designed for our sounds, by a species that had apparently spent the entire intervening history remembering us. We sent a response. Deshar drafted it formal, welcoming, cautious. Standard diplomatic language rendered in modern Vaelothi. I suggested we use the archaic form. He overruled me. We respond as we are now, not as we were then. They need to meet us, not our ancestors. He was right. I was still learning how often other people were right about things I thought were mine. On day 16, a shuttle detached from the object and descended toward Veladaan. The entire planet watched. Every screen, every relay. The defensive faction had grudgingly agreed not to interfere after the communication exchange, but they had positioned every armed vessel we had in a loose perimeter, which was roughly the equivalent of surrounding an ocean with teacups. I was on the reception platform. So was Deshar, Counselor Rav, a diplomatic team hastily assembled from whatever credentialed personnel hadn't already had nervous breakdowns, and Korath, who had been promoted 3 times in 2 weeks, and was handling it with the calm focus of someone who hadn't yet realized how far out of her depth she was. The shuttle landed. It was gray, not silver, not white, not luminous. Gray with visible seams, scorch marks around the atmospheric entry points, and a slight asymmetry that suggested either damage or a design philosophy that didn't prioritize aesthetics. It smelled, as the hatch opened and the atmosphere mixed, like mineral oil. I laughed. I couldn't help it. 3,000 years and the texts were right about the smell. They came out, 4 of them. They were not tall. The tallest was slightly shorter than me, and I'm not a large Vaelothi. They were soft-skinned, no scales, no plates, no visible armor of any kind. Their coloring varied, different shades of brown and tan and pink, as though their species couldn't agree on a single pigment. They had hair-thin filaments growing from their heads in different textures and lengths. Their eyes were small, forward-facing, set in flat faces with protruding noses. They were, and I mean this with all the love I now carry for them, not impressive to look at. One of them stepped forward. She was the shortest of the 4, older than the others. Her hair had gone white, and her skin had folded into patterns around her eyes and mouth that I would later learn were called wrinkles and indicated age. She moved carefully, as though her joints ached, and she carried no weapon, no device, no visible technology of any kind. She walked to the edge of the reception platform, looked up at the assembled officials, The cameras, the security perimeter, the crowd of thousands pressed against the barriers. And she said in that same imperfect, archaic Vaelothi, "We are sorry we are late. The path was longer than our grandmothers' grandmothers expected." Then she did something that confused everyone except me. She knelt, slowly, with the carefulness of old joints. She put her hand flat on the ground on the stone of the reception platform, which was the same stone as the Athendral, quarried from the same valley. And she closed her eyes, and she was quiet for a moment. "What is she doing?" Rav whispered. "I think she's greeting the ground," I said. "The original third stanza says, when they first arrived, they touched the soil and were quiet. The Sixth Keeper thought it was a religious ritual. I think it's just how they say hello to a place. They greet the place before they greet the people." The woman stood up. She looked at me somehow. She looked directly at me, out of everyone on the platform, and she said, "You are the one who keeps the telling?" I didn't know how she knew. Maybe she'd been listening to our broadcasts. Maybe she'd heard the planetary address where I'd dismantled my own mythology. Maybe they'd been listening for a long time. "I am," I said. "Did you keep it well?" The most important question anyone had ever asked me, and the only honest answer was the one that would shame me in front of my entire civilization on a day that would be remembered forever. "No," I said. "I changed it. I made you bigger than you were, more powerful, more beautiful. I turned you into gods." She studied me. Her small eyes were wet from emotion or from the atmospheric difference, I couldn't tell. "Why?" "Because the truth wasn't dramatic enough. Because I was vain. Because I thought the story needed to be more than what you actually were." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she made a sound, a short, rhythmic exhalation that I would learn was laughter. "We do the same thing. Our records of you, of the Vaelothi, we made you taller too. Braver. We gave you sharper crests and deeper voices. Our children think you are all warriors." Something in my chest cracked open. Every species polishes its friends. It is not a sin. It is how love works at a distance. You make the beloved shine brighter because you cannot touch them. So you make them larger, to feel them closer. She reached out and touched my crest. Her fingers were soft and warm and slightly trembling. "But we are here now. You can stop polishing. We are small and old and our ship smells bad. And we came back because the path was warm and because our grandmothers told our mothers to look for you. And our mothers told us. And we told our children. And no one forgot." She turned to Counselor Rav. "We saw your fields from orbit. The Thale is ready to harvest, but the temperature has risen beyond optimal. We adjusted the sunlight. Was this welcome, or did we overstep?" Rav opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "It was welcome. It was very welcome. We didn't understand what you were doing." "We should have spoken first. We were afraid you wouldn't remember us, and we didn't know the right words in your new language. So we did the thing we knew how to do. We helped with the sun. It was what our ancestors did the first time, and we thought, perhaps the gesture would be familiar, even if the words were lost." The shadow overhead shifted, not disappeared, adjusted. The shade thinned over the reception platform, letting more light through, warming the stone where we stood. A tiny adjustment, barely perceptible, like someone turning up a lamp so you could see each other's faces better. In the weeks that followed, I became obsolete. Not officially. My title remained. The civic chamber kept me on the communication team, but the function I'd served, the keeping of a story, the maintenance of a myth, was no longer needed, because the myth was standing in our plazas, eating our food, mispronouncing our vowels, and being aggressively, persistently, disappointingly real. The human delegation expanded to 40 over the next month. Engineers, agricultural specialists, linguists, medical researchers. They were exactly what the original texts described: competent, practical, physically unimpressive, technologically advanced, but not transcendent. Their ship, the 19-kilometer vessel they called Remembrance, was a generation ship, not a warship. A mobile habitat carrying 400,000 people, the descendants of a colonization program that had launched from their homeworld centuries ago with a list of coordinates where their ancestors had once helped someone, and a mandate to check on every one of them. A mandate. Not a mission, a cultural obligation. A promise baked into their civilization's identity so deeply that they had built a ship the size of a city and filled it with families and sent them into the void for the sole purpose of keeping old appointments. The Vaelothi who had been most afraid were the first to adapt. Fear, it turns out, is unstable. Once the object of fear becomes a person who sneezes in your pollen season and asks for directions to the nearest washroom, the fear doesn't transmute into courage or understanding. It just evaporates, leaving behind a faint embarrassment. The True Flame faction held out the longest. They'd built their identity on the luminous, godlike Burning Ones, and the real Human were an insult to that identity. For a few weeks, they insisted the delegation were imposters, a lesser species pretending to be the true Burning Ones, who were still coming, who would arrive in glory and validate the version of the story they'd been told. The version I'd told them. I went to their gatherings, not to argue, not to correct. I sat in the back, and I listened to them recite my embellished stanzas, and I heard my own words, my own vanity, my own artistic choices, my own decisions about what sounded better coming back to me as doctrine, as faith, as the foundation of a worldview that couldn't accommodate reality, because I had built the ceiling too high, and the real sky was lower. That was the weight I carried. Not guilt exactly. Guilt implies you did something to someone. I had done something to a story, and the story had done things to people, and the causal chain was long enough that I could have forgiven myself if I'd wanted to. I didn't want to. Korath found me in the Athendral one evening, 2 months after contact. She'd been working with the Human agricultural team, mapping the shade adjustments, helping calibrate the solar management system. They were installing a permanent orbital array that would give us control of our own light levels long after the Remembrance moved on to its next appointment. "You're reading the old texts again," she said. "I'm comparing them to what we now know. The originals are remarkably accurate. Almost everything the first Vaelothi recorded checks out." So the story was right all along. The story was right. The teller was wrong. She sat down next to me. Korath is young, barely past her second decade, and she has the directness of someone who hasn't yet learned that some truths are supposed to be approached sideways. "Do you know what the Human linguists told me today? They have a word mythologize. It means to turn a real person or event into a legend. And they say every culture does it. They did it to their own history constantly. They turned farmers into heroes, criminals into saints, ordinary decisions into cosmic battles. She said it's not a flaw, it's a feature. It's how a species encodes values into narrative form. You exaggerate the qualities you want to preserve. That's a generous interpretation. It's their interpretation. They're not angry about how you told the story. They're fascinated. They've been recording your embellished versions alongside the originals and studying the differences. Studying them, why? Because the differences tell them what the Vaelothi value. You made them taller. That means your culture prizes physical stature. You gave them fire. Your culture associates warmth with divinity. You gave them the power to crack moons. Your culture needs its saviors to be omnipotent. The embellishments are a portrait of us, not them. I sat with that for a long time. I still should have kept the story true. Maybe, but you kept the story alive. My generation knows the long-telling because of your recitations. My mother took me to my first alignment recitation when I was 6, and I remember the burning ones descending in chariots of light, and I was so afraid and so amazed that I decided to study the sky. That's why I became an orbital analyst, because of your version. The version that was wrong. The version that made a child look up. The remembrance stayed for 112 days. During that time, they installed the solar management array. They shared agricultural data accumulated across dozens of worlds. They taught our engineers principles of thermal shielding that advanced our material science by a generation. They updated their own language files with modern Vaelothi, and they recorded everything, every interaction, every meal shared, every song sung, every stumbling cross-species joke that landed badly and made everyone laugh anyway. They were recording us the way we had recorded them, building a new long-telling, their own version, from their own side, to carry to the next world, and the one after that. On day 109, the old woman, her name was Dr. Lena Makaya, and she was the mission's chief cultural officer, came to the Athendral. She asked to see the original texts. I showed her. She read them slowly, tracing the archaic Vaelothi characters with a fingertip, sounding out the words. When she reached the passage about the hull bending under the sun's heat, she stopped. "This is about the Korolev," she said. "The first ship. Our historical records confirm it. The heat shield warped during the solar shade maneuver. They nearly lost the vessel. They stayed anyway. They stayed. There was a vote. 63 crew members. 41 voted to hold position. 22 voted to withdraw. The 41 won, and the 22 stayed with them." The 22 who voted to leave, they stayed? They stayed. The vote was about what to do, not about who to be. Once the decision was made, it was everyone's decision. She looked at me. "Keeper Oren, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." I've gotten better at that recently. When you embellished the story, when you made us burn, when you gave us the power of gods, did it ever occur to you that you might be making us harder to meet? The question hit me in a place I hadn't known was vulnerable. What do you mean? If you're expecting a god, a real person is a disappointment. If you're expecting a being wreathed in sacred fire, a woman with bad knees who smells like ship recycler is a letdown. You made us magnificent, but you also made us unapproachable. You built a pedestal so tall that the real thing could only ever fall off it. She was right. She was right in a way that went deeper than my vanity, or my artistic choices, or my failure to preserve the texts. She was describing the fundamental violence of mythology. It replaces the reachable with the unreachable and calls it reverence. "The true flame faction," I said. "They can't accept you because you don't match what I told them you'd be." We've met this before. Not often, but it's happened. Worlds where our ancestors helped, where the story grew too large, and the descendants couldn't reconcile the legend with the reality. In 2 cases, they rejected us entirely. Decided we were imposters. We had to leave. Did that? I didn't know how to ask it gently. Did that hurt? She smiled. The wrinkles deepened around her eyes. "Keeper, we crossed the void for 32 centuries to keep a promise. We named a ship Remembrance and filled it with families and aimed it at the stars where our grandmothers once helped someone. Yes, it hurt. It hurt enormously. We came home to a house that didn't recognize us because someone had painted our portrait so beautifully that the real face was unacceptable. I'm sorry. I know. And it's not your fault entirely. This is what stories do. They grow. They have to, or they die. The problem isn't that you made us burn. The problem is that no one was there to say, but they also smelled like mineral oil. She laughed. Maybe the next keeper should be required to include at least one unflattering detail per stanza. Anchoring. Our psychologists call it anchoring. You keep one ugly truth in every beautiful story, so the audience remembers it's about real beings. On day 112, the Remembrance raised its orbit, retracted the solar shade our new array was operational, managing the light ourselves now, and oriented toward its next destination. Dr. Micaiah came to the Athendral one last time. She carried a small device, a rectangular object with a screen, primitive by our standards, but clearly old, clearly preserved with care. This is from the Korolev's archive, a personal log entry by Chief Engineer Yusuf Darzi, recorded during the original solar shade maneuver 32 centuries ago. She pressed a control. A voice emerged, flat audio, no visual, scratchy with age and format degradation. A male voice, speaking a language I didn't understand, but the doctor. Micaiah translated in real time. Day 41. Hull temperature has passed every red line we have. Thermal expansion has warped the port array, and we've lost sensor coverage on that side. Adia says the heat shield has maybe 10 days left at this rate before it compromises structural integrity. The Vaelothi are still down there. I can see them from the observation port. They're outside. They're in their fields. The crops are coming back. We can see the green from up here. A pause. Static. I voted to stay. Not because I think we'll make it. I voted to stay because I watched them carry their children into the shade we made, and they looked up. I don't know if they could see us. I don't think they could, but they looked up like they knew someone was there. That's enough. That's enough for me. The recording ended. Dr. Micaiah handed me the device. Keep this with your texts. The ugly truth and the beautiful one, side by side. An engineer who was scared and stayed anyway. No fire, no glory. Just a man watching a field turn green and deciding that was enough. They left. The sky was bright again, our own light, managed by our own array, tuned by technology they'd given freely. The Remembrance shrank to a point of light, then to nothing, carrying its 400,000 people and their old maps, and their imperfect pronunciation, and their unfathomable patience toward the next world on a list that was 32 centuries old and not yet finished. I went back to the Athendral. I opened the nitrogen cases. I placed Yusuf Darzi's recording device beside the original parchments, the ugly truth and the beautiful one, as she'd said. Then I sat down, and I began to write the new stanzas. Not embellished, not polished, not improved. I wrote what I saw. A short old woman with bad knees kneeling to touch our stone. 4 people in a gray shuttle that smelled like mineral oil. A voice in archaic Vaelothi asking if they could come closer. The shadow that was not a weapon, but a hand held between us and the heat. I included the unflattering details, the mispronounced vowels, the sneezing during pollen season, the wrinkles that deepened when she laughed, the slightly lopsided shuttle, the fact that when one of the engineers tried to eat Thale bread, he made a face so involuntary and so horrified that everyone on both sides laughed until they couldn't breathe. I wrote it all, the real thing, the whole real thing. And when I reached the part about the recording about Yusuf Darzi, 3,200 years dead, watching our fields turn green from behind a warping hull, I wrote the words exactly as they had been spoken. No edits, no improvements, no fire. I voted to stay because I watched them carry their children into the shade we made, and they looked up. I trained my replacement last year. Her name is Korath. She was reluctant. She said she was a scientist, not a storyteller. I told her that was exactly why she should be the one. The long-telling needed a keeper who loved precision more than drama, who would anchor every beautiful line with an ugly truth, who would resist the gravitational pull of better and stay faithful to real. She asked me what she should do if the new stanzas didn't fill a plaza, if the unembellished story felt small, if audiences wanted the fire back. I told her about a man named Yusuf Darzi, who watched a field turn green through a warping hull and decided that was enough. I told her that the story doesn't need to be bigger than the truth, because the truth, a species that crossed the void in a smelly gray ship because their grandmothers asked them to check on the neighbors, is the biggest thing I've ever encountered. It doesn't need fire. It doesn't need gods. It doesn't need me to make it shine. It shines because it's ordinary. Because they were small and soft, and they broke easily, and they came anyway. That's the story. I'm telling it plainly now. No embellishment, no polish. For the first time in my life, the story doesn't need me to be more than I am, and that is exactly enough.